This week's video we're going to be talking about Fujifilm's kit lens for the GFX system. Hi everyone, this is Dylan Golby. Welcome back to another Gear Short. In this week's video I'm going to be talking about Fujifilm's GF 35 to 70mm f4.5 to f5.6 kit lens for the GFX system. Now, this is a newly released lens that came out with the GFX 50S II, and our local Fujifilm office had a few samples up on their page, and honestly they didn't look great, and it looked like Fuji really wasn't putting their best foot forward with this lens. And I almost couldn't believe that with the GFX system, as they've really been trying hard to make the absolute best possible lenses and bodies that they can. And so I really wanted to try it out for myself, and when our local office actually added the 50S II and the kit lens to our 3-day rental program, I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity. Let me go down and see if I can borrow it for a couple of days and be able to just test it out for myself and put it through its paces and see whether, you know, it is as sort of bad as I expected or whether it was going to be a lot better than I expected. So let's jump into that today. Looking at the weather report the day before I borrowed this, it looked like we were going to have partly cloudy, so some sun, some clouds, some nice weather to be able to test this camera and lens with. But unfortunately, we've had a couple of days of really thick smog descend on the city. The air quality has been absolutely atrocious, so not the best situation for testing a camera body and lens in, but I have managed to get out there and make a few samples. Now, basically looking at this lens, you think, okay, it's a kit lens. This is something that is going to be people's introduction to the GFX system. This is maybe going to be the first lens that people buy when they first jump into, you know, the entry-level GFX like the 50S II. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm going to set myself the mission of basically taking this thing out and acting the tourist for a day. So I headed down to downtown Seoul, took this with me. I photographed everything from, you know, my lunch to the streets I was walking through, to the palaces that I visited, and then I went up and did a little cityscape at night just to put it through its paces and see how it would perform if I were to take it out and sort of use it like maybe the target market for this lens might use it. So first of all, the overall package. Honestly, it feels a little bit like holding, say, the GFX 100S with the 63mm f2.8 on the front of it. It's roughly the same size as that prime, and it feels to be roughly the same weight. I think it might be a little bit heavier, but it does feel roughly like that. Now, it seems like it's quite a compact lens, but in order to actually activate the lens itself, you do have to turn it from the locked position out to the 35mm position, and that gives you quite a bit more extension. So it will fit in your bag very nicely, but when you get it out, it's actually a little bit of a larger lens than it might initially seem. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the body, the Fujifilm GFX 50S II, because I feel like I covered absolutely everything about this in my 100S review. So if you're interested in hearing about how this body feels in comparison to the older cameras, I would say go over and check out that review. Honestly, it's basically a 50 megapixel sensor inside here without the phase detect autofocus. So you are still dealing with the slightly slower, slightly less confident contrast detect autofocus system that you find in the other Fujifilm GFX bodies. The first thing that I wanted to test when I borrowed this lens was the sharpness of the images that came out of it. Was it going to be capable of rendering the detail that the GFX sensor is capable of? And when I'd first looked at the samples on Fujifilm Korea's website, I thought, okay, so these are either completely out of focus or this lens is absolutely awful. And so I really wanted to give that a go. And the very first thing I did was just take it out onto my rooftop here and shoot a couple of the autumn leaves that we had left on the trees there. And I started at 70mm, right up close at its minimum focus distance at 5.6, which is the widest aperture that it has at that focus distance. At that focal length. And I was not impressed. It came back very soft with almost these glowing edges, and I thought to myself, that looks a lot like the XF 23mm f2 or the old Mark I lens for the X100 series. So I moved back a few centimeters and that disappeared. and it was absolutely great. There is so much detail that gets rendered by this lens, as long as you're not at that very, very closest focus distance. So once you stop down to, f8, f11, everything gets really, really good, even at the closest focus distance, but wide open, really, really close up, you're not going to get the most detail out of this lens. So aside from my sharpness tests, I did go out and just use this lens all day long in all sorts of situations, handheld, on a tripod, just to see how it would perform, and honestly, it produces plenty of detail. Now, I also did a couple of basic sit it on the tripod, photograph a flat wall type of tests with this to compare it to the 45 to 100 millimeter f4, which is a much more expensive, much heavier, much bigger lens than this one. And I wanted to see just what are the differences. And when you look at the center of the frame wide open, the f4 lens, the 45 to 100, does produce a little bit more fine detail at f4, f5.6, f8. They're pretty much the same at f11 and onwards, and that's at all focal lengths. Of course, I can't get to 35 on the 45 to 100, but comparing the focal lengths that I do have, they were very, very similar. The one difference that I did see was that the 45 to 100 renders quite a bit more detail in the corners of the frame. So until you start really stopping down to sort of f8 or f11, where this lens gets really good in the corners as well, the 45 to 100 is actually going to be a little bit better in those corners. So if you want detail from edge to edge wide open, maybe that's the lens to go for. But if you're going to be shooting at f8 or f11, you won't really see much of a difference, even if there is just a little bit more fine detail that comes from the 45 to 100. So in terms of the bokeh that this lens is going to produce, now you've got to remember that you are dealing with a fairly slow kit lens. So f4.5 to f5.6 is not going to give you the shallowest of depth of field unless you're really up close getting some very tight portraits or something like that. You're not going to see extremely shallow depth of field from this lens. So you're not going to get something like you would from, say, the 63mm f2.8 or the 110mm f2. That's just not going to be possible. However, the bokeh that it does produce seems to be reasonably smooth. It seems to be free of most aberrations, and to my eye, it actually looks quite good. And as long as you don't mind not having that extremely shallow depth of field, I think you'll be quite happy with the bokeh that comes from this lens. So let's take a look at a couple of samples. The focal range from 35 to 70mm might not seem like a lot, but it does cover some really useful focal lengths. So if you think about this in full frame terms, that's roughly a 28 to 55, or on the Fujifilm X systems, a 19 to 36 or 37-ish millimeters. So you're looking at a collection of very useful focal lengths, from slightly wide to sort of a normal focal length. And so, getting photos of some basic landscapes, or, maybe some portraits of friends, or some close-ups of your food or something like that, if you want to use your medium format camera for that, it's definitely going to be a really good set of walk-around focal lengths. Now, if you guys have seen my XF18mm f1.4 review, you'll know that I love that 27, 28mm focal length. I really enjoy the way that it renders the world, and so having that on the GFX as a walk-around lens was really, really fun, and I actually really enjoyed being able to get a little bit more than I normally would with my 45 to 100mm lens. When it comes to medium format lenses, getting those super fast primes like f1.4, f1.2 is difficult, if not impossible, especially when it comes to autofocus lenses. Now, Fujifilm do have their 80mm f1.7, which is a super fast lens for medium format systems. However, especially with zoom lenses, you're going to be looking at much smaller apertures of things like f4, f5.6, just because of the physics and the overall size that these lenses have to be able to gather that much light. So with this lens, we are dealing with an f4.5 to f5.6 variable aperture. So what that does mean is that in low light situations, you are going to have to ramp up that ISO if you want to shoot handheld. And having the IBIS in the 50S2 really does make a big difference there, as you're able to keep that ISO up much lower than you would as long as your subjects aren't moving. Now, if you think about depth of field, f5.6 on this lens is going to give you something more like what you might get from f4, f4.5 on a full frame camera, or around about f2.8, f3.5 on something like the Fujifilm X. However, it is still going to need f5.6 worth of light to be able to do that. While your depth of field might get a bit shallower, you're still going to need a lot more light. And so if you want any significant depth of field out of this lens, you might want to stop down to f11 or f16, and you are going to need a lot of light to be able to do that. So definitely something worth considering if you're thinking about having this as a walk around lens. Now, on a cloudy day means you might have to go up to ISO 400, ISO 800 to be able to shoot handheld easily, especially if you've got subjects moving in the frame. Now, on a sunny day, not so much of an issue. When it starts to get darker towards, blue hour and things like that, you're definitely going to want a tripod, or you're going to be shooting very wide open with this thing. One other thing with relation to the aperture is that on this lens you don't actually have the aperture ring. Now, might not seem like a big deal, but if you've used the other Fujifilm lenses, it can be really easy to be able to dial your aperture here and then set up each one of these front and rear dials here for ISO and shutter speed. That way you have all of your controls at your fingertips. Now, with the 50R or the 50S, the first 50S, you actually had dials on top, so you could quickly change those things. But with this one, you have to rely on the front and rear dials. And so not having that aperture ring means that one of these has to double functions if you want to have quick access. So I've actually got the front dial set to ISO, and then if you push it in, give it a click, it switches to aperture mode and you're able to change the aperture. And then the rear is actually set to shutter speed. Now, not a big deal, but it does slow you down a little bit. Hopefully you won't be changing ISO so often that that becomes a big deal, but if you are someone that likes to really change things up on the fly, it's just something to be aware of. When it comes to autofocus, I've done some significant tests with AFS, but not with AFC. So single autofocus, not continuous autofocus. When it comes to these contrast detect only systems, I don't find the AFC to really be reliable enough that I can use it for my everyday uses. With the PDAF on the GFX 100S, that's a little bit of a different story, but with CDAF only, it tends to pulse back and forth a little bit. And even if it is getting images in focus, you don't really feel confident because it's sort of pulsing back and forward constantly. But with AFS, it does a really good job, and this lens is up there with pretty much all of Fujifilm's other lenses. So I did put it on the 50S2, and I've also put it onto the GFX 100S, just so that you can see the difference that PDAF does make for single autofocus. So let's have a look at a couple of samples of that. So the only time that I really saw the AFS struggle was when I was out photographing the city at night when the smog rolled in, and it was super low contrast. So I wasn't able to get any of those beautiful big sun stars you might get off the lights or anything like that, simply because there wasn't enough contrast to produce them. But this lens really did struggle. So I was focusing on, street lights and traffic going down a highway, but it would sort of sit there and go, ooh, for 3 or 4 seconds before actually getting into focus. Now, this is where PDAF really comes in handy, and the X100V had no troubles at all. It was able to lock on really quickly. But with contrast detect, when there is no contrast, it becomes really difficult for this to actually focus on things. Now, with those high contrast edges, with city lights and things like that, once I got a bit closer to, the windows of stores and things like that, I just tested it to make sure it wasn't an issue with the night focusing, and it works absolutely flawlessly. So if you're not dealing with Seoul's air quality at times, then you probably won't ever run into that issue. Overall, this is a really great lens, especially considering its price when you purchase it as a kit. I believe it works out to be about $500 at that point, and for that price, the lens is an absolute steal. It renders plenty of detail, autofocus is good, it's got a great useful focal range. The only strike against it might be that, you want a faster aperture, but if you want that, you might want to go for the prime lenses that Fujifilm has made, as they're absolutely amazing, albeit a whole lot more expensive. So all in all, this is definitely the best quote-unquote kit lens that I've ever used. It produces really, really good images that live up to what you would expect from a GF lens. So will I be adding it to my kit? Well, not unless this Bitcoin rally really treats me well. It's not a lens that I feel like I would want to round out the kit that I have. So I have the 45 to 100mm f4 that I use for my work with Volvo, and I'll use it on my couple sessions and things like that. And that's a really, really good lens. And getting just that little bit wider for those jobs really doesn't mean much to me. So personally, I'm going to hang out for the 20 to 35mm that Fujifilm has on their roadmap, and hope that that is going to be the wide angle lens that I add to this kit. But for now, I think it's a really great lens if you're getting started with the GFX system, or perhaps you have something like the 110 and you just want something really, really different from it that you can walk around with. I think it's a great option for that. It's a lot lighter and a lot cheaper than the 32 to 64 or the 45 to 100, and it still produces really good images as long as you stop it down to, say, f8, and you're willing to work with that aperture for pretty much everything that you do. Okay, so that's been my 2 cents on the GF 35 to 70mm lens. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put them below and I'll do my best to answer them. Hope the video has been helpful for you. Stick around for the slideshow afterwards, and if you haven't already, please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers!